Okay, good morning everyone. So this is the second lesson for today and it is on lipids. So we looked at carbohydrates earlier and looked at how important they are to the body. So now we are going to look at lipids. So we've got the same learning objectives as the previous lesson and the next lesson will also have the same ones. So just to quickly go over them again, bronze is to define the term macromolecule and give some examples of macromolecules. The silver one is to explain the properties and uses of the three main macromolecules. And the gold one is to compare and contrast the three macromolecules used by the body and explain why they are an essential part of a balanced diet. So we've got a few new keywords that we need to be introduced to. So they are lipid, fatty acid, phospholipid, triglyceride, glycerol, insoluble, and hydrocarbon. So let's just go through those quickly. So a lipid is a molecule that is insoluble in water. It is a monomer unit of a lipid. So you should remember from the previous lesson that a monomer is the building block for a bigger molecule. And a phospholipid is the main component of a cell membrane. And phospholipids look like this as a single molecule. So they have a hydrophilic head and two hydrophobic tails. Now we'll get onto that later about what that means, but it is very important in the composition of a cell membrane. So here you have your tails. So they are made out of lipids, as the name suggests. So there you go, there's your very simple diagram on a phospholipid, a simple single phospholipid molecule, and then they all join up and form the cell membrane, which we'll get onto later. A triglyceride is a molecule formed out of fatty acids and a glycerol molecule, and it is how fat is stored within the body, and a glycerol is how the body stores triglycerides within the body. So a triglyceride is a molecule formed out of 3 fatty acids and is how fat is stored, and the glycerol is how the body stores the triglycerides. So glycerol stores the fat and the triglycerides is how the fat is stored. An insoluble is a molecule which cannot dissolve in water, and a hydrocarbon is a long chain comprising of hydrogen and carbon molecules only. The only part is very important for this definition, so make sure you include only in there somewhere. So fats are found in the animals we eat. I've got Shaun the sheep here. I don't really want to eat Shaun because he's very cute. And we've got the chickens from Chicken Run. Hopefully you've all watched these films because they are brilliant. And it's just a bit of fun to add into the lesson, really. So lipids are either either solid or liquid. So fats are different forms depending on if they're unsaturated or saturated, and we'll go into that a little bit later. So for example, we've got lard here, and that is a solid at room temperature, and then you've got olive oil, which is a fat, and it is liquid at room temperature. You can also force fats to become solid from a liquid at room temperature, and that is an artificial process, and it forms something called a trans fat, which is very bad for you and can cause significant problems. And we'll get onto that a little bit later. And it's also linked into AS and A-level knowledge too. So just to pique your interest a little bit, to give a little bit more of an insight into what is going on with these fats. So there are 3 types of lipids, which is similar to the 3 types of carbohydrates. So you have triglyceride, cholesterol, and phospholipid. Now, triglyceride is the main one we are going to look at. That is the main one you need to know about. Cholesterol and phospholipid will just add a little bit more information, a little bit more background information about fats and types of lipids. So let's start with triglycerides then. So Looking at this diagram here, you can see that there are 3 fatty acids and a glycerol molecule. So that is why it's called triglyceride. So the tri meaning it is composed of 3 fatty acids. So there are 3 involved in this molecule. And then there is 1 glycerol molecule. And the glycerol forms the backbone of a triglyceride. And then the fatty acids sort of stem out of it. You can see a good version of that in the book, where it basically goes like that, and then you've got a bit of a zigzaggy line going on. 3 zigzaggy lines. I appreciate how hard it is to draw on this. But that is how it is shown in the book. So a glyceride basically means it contains a glycerol molecule, which is this bit in the middle. So when triglycerides are digested, they are broken down into either fats, which circulate around the body in the bloodstream, or glycerol, which is stored in the liver for later use to be broken down as energy for an energy source. So triglycerides and lipids are made up of carbon and hydrogen, but only a small number of oxygen atoms. And it also takes more energy to break the bonds in a molecule of fat in comparison to carbohydrates. So that is why we tend to use carbohydrates first. If there are carbohydrates available, we'll use the carbohydrate first, and then we'll go on to the lipids and proteins. Or unsaturated. So saturated fats include no double bonds within the hydrocarbon tail. So I'm going to do a very simple molecule here. This is ethane because there's only 2 carbons. So you have your hydrogens here and your carbons in the middle. So the hydrogens surround the carbons. And as you can see from this diagram that I'm drawing here, there are no double bonds in the tail. So the tail being this middle bit. If it did have a double bond, that would be an unsaturated hydrocarbon. So that is a saturated fat. So it's saturated because there are no double bonds. So saturated fats are typically solid at room temperature, and large quantities of saturated fats are found in meats, fat on meat, butter, lard, and cheese. And they also raise the blood cholesterol levels. So that can be quite harmful to human health, which we'll touch on later as to why that is. So if we were to, you would put a double bond in here, and you would remove a hydrogen on each side. So that is now a unsaturated fat because there is a double bond within the hydrocarbon tail. And these are usually liquid at room temperature. So examples include olive oil, seed, and nut oils. And they can be either monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, or trans fats. Is that because I've got some things that are going to come up in a minute and I don't want to cover them all the other way around. So monounsaturated fats have a single double bond in the hydrocarbon tail, and that is what I just showed you with the example of ethane and ethene. Ethane being the one with the single bonds, and ethene being the one with the double bond in it, and only 4 hydrogens in comparison to 6 hydrogens. So polyunsaturated would be in a longer chain, and that is when there are more than one double bond in the hydrocarbon chain. So there might be, say, 10 or 12 double bonds in the hydrocarbon chain. That is a polyunsaturated fat. And then you have sort of the red herring that you wouldn't really think about. You have trans fats. These are hydrogenated fats, and they are designed to make naturally liquid fat at room temperature a solid by adding double bonds. That is done artificially through a factory process. And an example of this that we see in everyday use and everyday life is margarine. So that is actually liquid at room temperature, but because it's gone through that process and the double bonds have been added to make it solid at room temperature, it has become a trans fat and it is now solid. But they can be quite detrimental to human health, which is a debate you could go quite far into, and it's probably one that I'm not going to go into right now because there's quite a lot of things that can be said about this topic. So, phospholipids then. These are a crucial component of cell membranes. So here's your diagram here. I did show you a really simple diagram earlier of one that I drew. They have hydrophilic heads and hydrophobic tails. So the hydrophilic bit means that it is water loving. So it is attracted to water molecules. And the hydrophobic bit means that it is water hating. So that means that it is repelled. It repels the water and it goes and faces away from it. So that is why this bilayer forms. So it is like a sandwich, basically, of molecules. And they form this way because these are the tails in the middle and they are hydrophobic. So they are trying to get away from the water. And the heads on the outside are in contact with the water and they are hydrophilic. So they are attracted to the water. So this is called a phospholipid bilayer. And that is because of the properties of these molecules being the hydrophilic hydrophobic interactions. So a good way to describe how hydrophilic hydrophobic interactions work is to look at a magnet. So if you've got two magnets that you put together and you put both of the north poles together, what happens? Well, they repel because they are the same pole, and that is basically what's happening with the hydrophobic tails and the water. So say the water and the hydrophobic tails are both north pole, they would repel, and that would also mean that the hydrophilic heads are south pole if the water is north pole, so opposites attract. So that is a good way that one of my teachers described it to me. Some of you might get it, some of you might think of a different idea. It's whatever works for you, really. It's a bit more of AS knowledge that I put in here, as it fits in well with the topic of lipids and fatty acids. But it is good knowledge to have, and you will learn more about hydrophilic and hydrophobic throughout your GCSE anyway. So if we move on to cholesterol, cholesterol is a fat produced naturally by the liver. It is healthy in low quantities, but in high quantities it can build up in the blood vessels and contain a blockage. So here you can see a blockage which is called a plaque, and that stops the blood from going through the artery and the vessels, and it essentially ends up in either a ruptured vessel, so the vessel essentially explodes, or it results in the death of some of the tissues. So say that happened in the heart, it could cause heart disease, which means that part of the heart tissue is dead, so it doesn't work anymore. The same can also happen in the brain, and that is how a stroke happens. A clot goes into the brain and it kills off part of your brain, so you get a stroke. So it can be quite serious because it can lead to a heart attack, which is called a cardiac arrest, deep vein thrombosis, which is where a part of the clot breaks off into the bloodstream, or a stroke, which is where part of the brain is starved of oxygen and it dies off essentially. And foods that contain high quantities of cholesterol include cheeses, normally very mature cheeses like mature cheddar. So if you get a blood test and your doctor tells you you have quite high cholesterol, you need to be careful of what you eat because that could worsen the impact of it on you. So let's move on to the functions of fats. There are two main functions. You've got energy and warmth. So excess fat is stored within lipocytes, which are the cells that store and make fat. It's also lipocytes are found and make up adipose tissue, which is tissue that's normally found in areas like your stomach and your thighs and hips, anywhere that you might naturally store fat to keep you warm. So adipocytes and lipocytes have a fat reservoir, which can be seen here. So it's quite a big reservoir, and it can expand, and it has a nucleus, which is, as you know, essential for a living cell, because that controls what enters and leaves the cell. So these expand in size until the fat is then used for fuel later on, and this shows in people that are quite overweight and obese, because they don't use the fat for fuel. It just builds up and up, so that's why they get bigger. And they also functions of fats is for warmth. So take these polar bears, for example. These polar bears have very thick skin, and they also have a thick layer of blubber underneath, which is fat. And they also have their fur as well. They have 2 coats of fur, and they even have furry toes to keep their feet warm. Because it is so cold in their habitat that they need all of this protection against the cold. So those are the 2 main functions of fats that you need to know: energy and warmth. So one final thing that I need you to do for this lesson is to complete this Kahoot quiz. The game pin is there, so if you just enter that game pin into kahoot.it, and the quiz should come up for you. I'm also going to link it in the description box down below. This is the link here, and just have a go at it. I've set it to end on the 3rd of February at 5 p.m, so you have until tomorrow at 5 p.m. to complete this quiz and submit it, and then I can see how well you understood this topic.